Greetings, family. Welcome back to the channel. We have some serious business, some serious discussions to talk about because we have a changing world that we're living in. You know, there's been a pandemic we've been experiencing because of the coronavirus that's been unleashed on the population. And we have hate crimes, we have population issues, we have all these things going on in our world. And how do you make sense of that? Well, the reality is people study these things to see how people are going to respond later on in life. I'm trained as a physiological psychologist, so I study behavior. I've studied it in the lab, I've studied it in humans, and so I'm using the example of what people have done in the past for you to pay attention to understand what's going on now. If we just fast forward, this pandemic has created a scenario where everybody's isolated and everybody's been separate and alone, and that's not how human beings are supposed to be. So now as we are coming back into contact with one another, we're seeing just enhancements in violence and just bad behavior exhibited towards mankind. Hate crime homicides reached a record in 2019. There's a study by the FBI. The FBI, that's the Federal Bureau of Investigation, reported a record number of homicides classified as hate crimes in 2019, more than doubling the previous record set in 2018. According to fresh data analyzed by a research center that focuses on extremism, the number of hate crimes also was at its highest level in more than a decade. The FBI's data shows hate crimes had been trending downward since the most recent peak in 2008, but steadily increased almost every year since 2014. The 51 so-called hate homicides the FBI recorded last year, that's in 2019, were more than double, well, 2017 was more than double than 2018 level due to mass domestic terror attacks by white supremacists became increasingly more lethal. White supremacist far-right extremists motivated homicides rose for the third consecutive year in 2019, the report said. Similar findings have come from the Department of Homeland Security, which recently said more Americans were killed by domestic extremists, primarily white supremacists, and others on the far right than foreign-inspired ones such as Al-Qaeda in 2018 and 19. White supremacists among all domestic violent extremists will remain the country's most persistent and deadly threat, the department also recently warned. Now, Dr. Welsing wrote the ISIS paper. She talks about the crest theory of color confrontation way back in 1969, 1970. So she was explaining how this white supremacist mindset is becoming dangerous back then, and now we see it on full-scale amounts as we're dealing with this pandemic. Look at these studies. There's a researcher named John Calhoun. We're going to go through in this segment, we're going to look at past discussions on this, and we'll conclude our discussion here about the realities of how this research is translated into real-world dynamics. Listen to this.
Half years ago, we found Dr. John Calhoun knee-deep in mice in the mouse heaven at the National Institute of Mental Health Animal Center near Washington. Dr. Calhoun wanted to find out what would happen to a mouse colony given everything mice need except living space. The result was chilling. 2.5 years ago, more than 2,000 mice were packed into Mouse City. Today, a tiny handful of survivors huddles in one corner of the city. Dr. Calhoun explains what the overcrowding did to Mouse City's inhabitants.
The last 1,000 animals born never learned to develop the social behaviors. They never learned to be aggressive, which is necessary in defense of home sites. They never learned to court. There was no mating. Being no mating, there were no progeny, and the older animals whose behavior was already becoming disrupted, they eventually reached an age too old to reproduce, and so it was all left up to these last 1,000 or so, whom we call the beautiful ones, because not engaging in any stressful activity and only paying attention to themselves, they groomed themselves well, so they looked very fine specimens. But from that point on, which was about the time that you were here 2.5 years ago, this reproduction totally ceased, and the animals have just aged and died.
At least one human group, the Eat tribe, discovered in Africa by Dr. Colin Turnbull, has gone through a similar terrible process.
Now you heard that Africa, that was mentioned. So we know that population control has been something they've been dealing with and talking about for years with Africa. So let me fast forward in his discussion about how he's trying to explain why there should be a concern about looking at population control. Okay.
This age-old trend, not age-old, 40,000 years, rather short time, if this trend continued, you would have instantaneous doubling. Well, we know that's impossible, and that's the critical question, is that something is going to happen, that man will be different from the start of man, and this is where man started about 40,000 years ago as a cultural animal, not as a biological animal. He went considerably back in time below that. But at beginning this new process when he, quote, now was the only animal who could really control his numbers, that is to keep enlarging them, which is increasing his own potentiality by so doing. And this has continued until now we hit a critical point here where this process can't continue. And so from this time, 40,000 years ago, to early in the next century, defines what we call man. And man ends at this point, whether there are a lot of bodies around, he's going to have to be something quite different from what he has been historically. And so one thing that he could do, and we're certainly capable of doing it, is keep reproducing. So that's one choice. And another choice that we have, which will have to be in effect by early in the next century, is that he can stabilize the population. That is, one, he can keep going not very much longer, above 9, well, I haven't got this figure. This would have been at 9 billion. I haven't quite gotten my figures here. It's sort of doubled to 9 billion. But if this is the end point, if the number of children per adults continues as it's been in the past, there would be about 9 billion people at this point. If we begin slowing down so that the population can stabilize, which is the ecological model as we've tried to do for wildlife management, to maintain a stable population, then with fewer children, we might keep at this level, we have 7.5 billion. Now, the critical point here is how many adults. Ideally, there should be, at this upper optimum, 3.5 billion adults in order to make most effective the network of people communicating with people. However, if we go on there's a third choice, and this is the population will begin slowly to decline. And if we go towards that goal, we would have at that point roughly about 6.3 billion total people, with considerably less than 2 children per family.
Doctor, what do you think now of the stress on environmental problems, trying to solve them? Should government, the politicians, pay more attention to this problem, do you think?
Government. You know darn well the government is looking at these types of studies and this type of research to see what it is that they can do to manipulate them. So that question was very loaded, and as we start to look at the experiments themselves, we can start to see how things in real life are occurring, especially as we're isolated with this pandemic, and people are coming out of the pandemic and acting crazy, violence, impatience, not being able to work with another person. So, as he said, human beings changed over time, and now we're looking at that in real time. Here's another segment with John Calhoun.
The work of Dr. John Calhoun at the National Institute of Health in Washington, D.C. has attempted to answer this question. In a unique experiment that took years to complete, Dr. Calhoun used white mice to study population growth and its effects on individual behavior. In addition to his renowned research papers, he has recorded some of these observations on film. In this 16-cell mouse habitat, utopian conditions of nutrition, comfort, and housing were provided for a potential population of over 3,000 mice. Yet, in spite of ideal conditions, the mouse population met with catastrophe. Individuals were kept track of by color markings on their fur. Factors which normally control population growth, such as predation by owls or cats, were eliminated. Transmissible disease was also reduced. In effect, the mouse universe simulated the present situation of a continually expanding population of humans. To see how Dr. Calhoun's mouse universe grew, we'll use the familiar population graph again. Within the first 100 days, the mice went through the period Dr. Calhoun called strive. This was a period of adjustment. Territories were established, and nests were made. The next period lasted about 250 days. The population of the mice doubled every 60 days. This was called the exploit period. The use of resources became unequal. Although each living unit was identical in structure and opportunities, more food and water was consumed in some areas. As the population increased, most mice associated eating and drinking with the presence of others, and crowding developed in certain units. The third period, consisting of 300 days, found the population of mice leveling off. This was called the equilibrium period. Dr. Calhoun noticed that the newer generations of young were inhibited, since most space was already socially defined. At this time, some unusual behavior became noticeable. Violence became prevalent. Excess males strived for acceptance, were rejected, and withdrew. Huddling together, they would exhibit brief flurries of violence among themselves. The effects of violence became increasingly visible. Certain individuals became targets of repeated attack. These individuals would have badly chewed and scarred tails. Other young mice growing into adulthood exhibited an even different type of behavior. Dr. Calhoun called these individuals the beautiful ones. Their time was devoted solely to grooming, eating, and sleeping. They never involved themselves with others, engaged in sex, nor would they fight. All appeared as a beautiful exhibit of the species, with keen, alert eyes and a healthy, well-kept body. These mice, however, could not cope with unusual stimuli. Though they looked inquisitive, they were, in fact, very stupid. Dr. Calhoun called the last period the die phase, leading the population into extinction. Although the mouse utopia could house 3,000, the population began to decline at 2,200. In the shift from the equilibrium to the die phase, each animal became less aware of associates, despite all animals being pushed closer together. Dr. Calhoun concluded that the mice could not effectively deal with the repeated contact of so many individuals. The evidence of violence increased to the point where most individuals had had their tails bitten to some degree. Eventually, the entire mouse population perished. Dr. Calhoun's experiment is a classic example of a typical population and its growth when left unchecked. Research in this area continues under his supervision. Currently, Dr. James Hill has taken the basics of the Calhoun experiment to study social behavior even more closely. In his experiments, rats are used instead of mice.
So mice, rats, and now we can look at how this translates to humans, because you'll start to see how they have the environment controlled and they had the animals being manipulated in the environment. The same way people are being manipulated now with things going into the body and then observing and tracking them.
Healthy individuals are selected to start the population. The rats are anesthetized so that Dr. Hill can perform a minor operation necessary to the success of his experiments. A small electromagnetic encapsulated device is implanted into every rat. This small unit enables sensing devices to keep track of the movement and position of each individual in the population. After surgery, the rats are introduced to their new, multi-leveled home, all at the same time. The rats immediately begin to explore their new environment, prior to organizing territories and nesting. Dr. Hill will trace how individuals move about in crowded situations. This movement is followed by tubular sensing devices. Every time a rat enters or passes through a tube, the unit detects and registers its presence. This constant movement is monitored by computer. Dr. Hill has observed that the larger the population...
So, the last piece about computers being monitored, 5G, people being tagged. There's a lot going on here that people have studied, or researchers have studied over the years, and now we see it manifested in real life. Let me go ahead and show you some more examples of aberrant behavior that is observed in the animals, and then we'll conclude this segment with some brief discussions about how this really translates, because people are saying that, oh, this has no impact on what's really going on in real life, and you're right about that sometimes, but the perspective of the people doing the research really has an impact on what's going to happen with the results.
To remain. These few remaining males began exhibiting odd behavior. Though they would spend most of their time in the burrows with the females, hiding away from the dominant male, they would never attempt to mate with any of them. Instead, perplexingly, they would try to mate with the dominant male, and even more perplexing, the dominant male would not fight these attempts. At the same time as this was happening, the effect of Calhoun's special feeders was taking hold. Since procuring food was such a lengthy process at the hard food feeders, it was common for one rat to join another while in the process of feeding. By this method, the rats slowly became conditioned to eating in the company of other rats until, eventually, the rats would refuse to eat unless another rat was present. Since more rats tended to be in the center pens, this behavior meant that, over time, more and more rats made their way there, further condensing them. This heightened the proximity of an already cramped population. In the experiments with the powdered food, this effect was far less pronounced. With these factors combined, Calhoun noted what he called a behavioral sink, or an increase in pathological activity in the rats due to the stress involved in such high population density. For the females, the behavioral sink manifested in reduced capacity for nest building and young rearing. Infant rats are extremely dependent upon their mothers for nearly all things. However, under the effects of the behavioral sink, the mothers would often be interrupted in their nest-building practices to engage in some other social activity. As time wore on, this led to sparser nests which could not house the young properly. If a mother decided to move her litter, she often would only move some of them or scatter them about the pen in separate locations. What's more, when female rats are ready to mate, the males can sense it, and the enclosed space meant that a female could not escape the continuous advances of the males during these periods. Even when they would enter their nests for a reprieve, they would be followed in and harrowed. These factors together resulted in an extremely high infant mortality rate, in one case reaching 96%. For the males, this manifested in different ways. The dominant males would occasionally lash out in violence against the other members of the pen, including infants, often biting and wounding their tails. Among the lower-class males were three groups. The first he described as the homosexuals, which he immediately corrects as pansexuals, who would not compete for status but would often attempt to mate with any other rat, regardless of gender or age. Much like in the end pens, these advances went unchallenged. The second group he described as somnambulists, who moved slowly through the pen without interacting with other individuals in any fashion, and the other rats, in turn, ignored them, except in rare circumstances. These rats, externally, he described as fat, sleek, and healthy-looking. But to him, the strangest group was the third, which he named the probers. These rats were hyperactive, hypersexual, and pansexual. Despite violence from the dominant males, they would viciously pursue females in heat, eschewing any sort of courtship ritual and following them into their burrows to mate. Later on in the experiments, they would often find the corpses of the improperly cared-for young, which they would cannibalize. In time, one of Calhoun's assistants would publicly describe these pens as hell.
Hell. So, you look at the inner city living and the projects that were created, and now the changes that are going on with some of the living arrangements. People study this. They look at this and see how it is that people want to respond. And behaviorally, it's problematic, but then in the society, it's problematic because you see these aberrant behaviors. So now let's see how then, I guess, the world responds to this, because some people are saying, oh, this does not have any relevance to human behavior, and it's not looking at the social dynamics, and some of that is really true, because people seldom really look at the dynamics of poverty and who creates poverty. Why don't you have a job? Why isn't there free access to health care? All those factors come into play. But listen to this.
For how they tried, no evidence of a widespread behavioral sink could be found in urban areas. But this did not dissuade Calhoun. Even as others explored the problem of overcrowding, Calhoun frantically continued his research. Now a celebrated success and emboldened by the public acceptance of his ideas, he resumed his work at NIM on an even larger scale, though again away from the public eye. He spent his time on new subjects as he continued to perfect his enclosures and experiments until finally, after 11 years, Calhoun revealed his magnum opus through an article he entitled Death Squared, which was published in the journal Proceedings of the Royal Society of Medicine in January of 1973. The lengthy opening to this article was undeniably apocalyptic. Calhoun wrote, "I shall largely speak of mice, but my thoughts are on man, on healing, on life and its evolution. Threatening life and evolution are the two deaths, death of the spirit and death of the body. Evolution, in terms of ancient wisdom, is the acquisition of access to the tree of life." Unquote. He goes on to heavily reference revelations and of the riders of the apocalypse, using them to proclaim that the Hippocratic Oath applies not only to the body, but to the spirit. After this dramatic introduction, he described his test. For the most part, these new experiments were similar to his 1963 trials, including unlimited access to food and water, protection from the elements and predators, and safeguards against disease. Many parts, however, were drastically altered. As Calhoun mentions in his introduction, the Norway rats used in his first publicized experiments were replaced with albino house mice, which were taken from a breeding group from the National Institutes of Health made specifically to prevent communicable disease. To fit his new subjects, Calhoun had designed an entirely new enclosure. This version was much more vertical, with 16 wall-mounted housing areas for the rats at the tops of long metal tubes, which Calhoun called walk-up apartments. At the bottom of each apartment was a virtually unlimited supply of food, water, and nesting material. With the space provided, Calhoun estimated that it could potentially hold 3,840 mice. He named this enclosure Universe 25. Calhoun's methods also had changed. Rather than instituting population controls, he would interfere far less. His plan was to place 8 mice in the enclosure, 4 male and 4 female, and simply watch and wait. Calhoun observed 4 distinct phases in the ensuing experiment. Phase A was predictable, constituting the time period before the first new mice were born, which ended up being 104 days. For the mice, these days were, quote, marked by considerable social turmoil. After the social order was established and the first brood was born, the population began Phase B, which Calhoun named the exploitation phase. During this time, the mice doubled in number every 55 days as new young grew to maturity and had their own young. This doubling continued until day 315, after which the doubling rate slowed to a rate of 145 days, nearly 3 times as long. By this point, the different broods had clumped into one side of the pen, exhibiting the same sort of clumping as the Norway rats, but this time without any coaxing from Calhoun's designs. This change in the rate of procreation marked Phase C, which Calhoun labeled as the stagnation phase. This is when the most notable events occurred, and they eerily mirrored Calhoun's rat experiments. In a natural setting, those mice which find no social niche will leave the colony, but in this experiment, emigration was impossible, and so those forced to remain withdrew from society. These dejected males formed a large pool in the center of the enclosure. They quickly became characterized by both their inactivity and their many scars and wounds. Occasionally, they would grow agitated and attack one another, and with nowhere to retreat, the recipient of these attacks would simply lay still and endure the assault. The outcast females, rather than joining them, would retreat to the highest apartments and live quietly among one another. It was during this time that the behavioral sink manifested, with mice gathering around specific food hoppers in large numbers, while others remained almost entirely untouched.
So that dynamic of being manipulated in an environment, and for us to be isolated for this many years now, as a result of the pandemic, has changed how people operate, how they deal with one another, how they interact. And so it's studied in the lab, and now we see it in real life. And so one of the easiest places this can be actually studied is, I guess you would say, the prison system. So let me see if they can read that part about the prison.
Around specific food hoppers in large numbers, while others remained almost entirely untouched, showing how, again, the need for social interaction had become so intertwined with the need for food that the former had overtaken the latter. The males who had won the initial fights also were placed under extreme stress. As more and more mice reached maturity from within and without, the leaders of the social groups continually had to patrol and defend their territory. Eventually, they reached the point of exhaustion and could not defend the females within their group. These females were therefore forced to defend the nest themselves, even when nursing their young, leading to generalized behaviors, so does ideational generativity for man. Loss of these respective complex behaviors means death of the species. But even as Calhoun was performing his research on mice, others had been at work applying his theories to humans. By this point, researchers had moved to more specific locations of overcrowding rather than the generalized location of cities, testing the effects on students in dormitories and patients at hospitals, but the most fruitful example they discovered was in prisons. Paul Paulus from the University of Texas wrote that prisons were the perfect place for this sort of study, describing the social interaction between inmates as intense, prolonged, inescapable, and realistic. The prison in the study also offered the closest analog to Calhoun's rat experiments, since the prisoners could not escape the company of others, even in their communal cells. There, they found connections between over-socialization and suicide, violence, psychopathy, and stress.
So, now let's go ahead and conclude with some comments and let you reflect on this in real life. So what we are dealing with here is the pandemic and isolation and the changing of behavior that results from this alteration in our social environment. So I'm saying, as I began, that violence has been escalated because of these circumstances. Beyond thinking about what may be put into someone's body, beyond saying about some pharmaceutical manipulation, all we're speaking of is the reality that you can manipulate the environment and make people not be who they really should be as human beings. Now, this was done like in the 70s. So we're talking about 50 plus years ago that these experiments were being conducted. So in one of the graphs that Calhoun was writing, he's talking about 1984 was going to be like a plateau period. You think about 1984, think about George Orwell's 1984, the book 1984, and the Big Brother and all the changes about what's going on in society. And we now see that in 2020, 2022, all that being manifested, speaking about Big Brother and surveillance and being watched. So it says early in the next century, he was saying that these things need to be dealt with in terms of population control, and that's exactly what's happening with the pandemic. Whether or not it was unleashed or not unleashed, we're dealing with population control. It says that you might reach a critical point where you have to make a decision. And so these studies that were done on how do you manage a virus, all these movies that were put out, Outbreak, Contagion, all these things that were talked about for years. They were talked about for years because those that want to control the world are saying there's a critical point where you have to make a change. And so now we reach this pandemic plateau. So they mentioned about unusual behavior. The unusual behavior really is violence. And we have a war going on right now over there in Europe. War is not the answer. But some people seek that because it drives the economy. It's about money. It's about material possessions. So those are what some people value a lot in their cultural experience. Therefore, they're going to push that. It was interesting that they call some of these animals stupid. But we can't be anthropomorphic. That means you put your human experience into an animal and like the animal acts like you, but you call some of those animals stupid. They might call human beings stupid, lazy, give you the N-word, all these negative words about who you are. And so people give labels, but to label the animals like that and call them like they're human beings, like they're stupid, kind of odd. The inner city living, it was expressed in that, but that's as it try to construct these animal environments. Their inner city living is really like the projects. And you just put people on top of people, and you expect there to be normality. Well, you have a whole lot of aberrant behavior that results from that, and when people don't have the jobs, you really have a problem. And when they were saying in the video about watch and wait, do experiments to sit back and watch and wait. I've done these experiments in animals. I've had experiments with hamsters. I studied hamsters. These were on rat and mice in these experiments, but I've had to look at hormones and behavior, and I've had castrated animals who don't have testosterone, and these are males experiencing another male, and they're supposed to fight in a resident intruder paradigm, and that males, I have it on videotape, who have been castrated, they actually went into a lordosis. That is actually, they put their body rigid so that the male can mount if they were female. So without the hormones from the testosterone, giving that adult animal what it should be doing for its stereotypical behavior, it altered its response. So you look at those animals that were in that situation, talked about the homosexual animals, the somnambulists, probers, called pansexuals. I mean, so the environment that's manipulated can make people also do behaviors that they shouldn't be doing. So the last part where they were speaking about prisons, the 13th Amendment. I mean, if you ever saw that documentary by Ava DuVernay about how the prison system, it's just extended slavery. Douglas Blackman wrote a book called Slavery by Another Name. So when we see these transitions in society and people being manipulated and being controlled, we have to start looking at research that has been done over the years. Now see how is it manifested in real life, and those that want to control behavior will use these studies to do that. So I just wanted to present that to you so you have some thoughts about, again, why there's so much violence and many problems that have come out of this pandemic that are now, how to resolve it, how do we fix it. So these are some things to think about. And so if you have any more questions, you can go ahead and email me, and we can go ahead and discuss that. Thank you for spending some time on the YouTube channel as we talked about the pandemic and isolation, which we're still experiencing violence. We don't want to keep experiencing that, but we want to somehow resolve what's going on in our communities for positive human development. Thank you.